The tall shooter, still chuckling to himself, adjusted his custom-built rifle with exaggerated movements, making sure to catch everyone's eye. His rifle gleamed under the bright sun, the optics so advanced it looked like something straight out of a high-tech movie. The others nodded in agreement, making comments about how precision engineering had brought shooting to a new level. It was clear they were all proud of their gear, and even prouder of their skills, which they liked to remind everyone of with every shot they fired. As the shooters continued to bask in their own superiority, the woman, unnoticed by most, continued to prepare. She methodically checked her rifle, an older model that had clearly seen better days. The wood of the stock was chipped in places, the metal surface worn smooth from years of use. It was nothing like the futuristic rifles everyone else was holding, but it had been with her for years. She knew every inch of it, its quirks and strengths, and it had never let her down. She didn't need a $5,000 rifle to know how to hit a target. As she loaded the rifle, her movements were deliberate, her focus unwavering. Despite the noise, the banter, and the dismissive looks from the other shooters, she was perfectly calm. There was no rush, no pressure. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. This was her moment, her time to shoot, and she was here to do it the way she always had. The man with the custom rifle, noticing her slow and deliberate movements, couldn't help but snicker. "All right, sweetheart," he called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I hope you're ready to see what a real shooter looks like. You might want to step back after I show you how it's done with a rifle that actually works." The others laughed, some shaking their heads in mock sympathy. They had already decided that this woman with her outdated rifle was nothing more than a distraction from their own superior gear and expertise. They were convinced her chances of even hitting the target were slim to none. They had all been shooting for years, invested in the best equipment, and still, they didn't doubt for a second that they were in a league of their own. The woman didn't acknowledge the taunts. Instead, she focused on the target downrange. It was a standard paper target, about 100 yards away, with a familiar bullseye in the center. Her eyes were locked on the bullseye as she stayed her hands, adjusting her stance slightly. She had done this 1,000 times before. She didn't need fancy gadgets or scopes that cost more than a car. All she needed was focus, patience, and the steady, rhythmic breathing that came with experience. The tall shooter smirked, taking his place to the line with an air of superiority. He was ready to show everyone just how good he was. He was a champion after all. No one was going to beat his score. The others leaned forward, eager to see the results. They had seen him shoot countless times, and his reputation spoke for itself. He aimed carefully, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. His gaze was focused on the target as he took a deep breath, the tension palpable. With a swift motion, he fired. Bang! The sound of the gunshot echoed across the range. The others stood silently, watching as the smoke cleared. His shot had landed, but it was nowhere near the center of the bullseye. It was off to the right, about 6 inches away from the perfect score. The group's mood shifted slightly, but they didn't show much concern. All right, one of them said, trying to lighten the mood. "It's just a warm-up shot. Let's see what you've got next." The woman, meanwhile, was unfazed by the exchange. She had seen this before. People with the best gear often overestimated their skills. Confidence was important, but too much of it could cloud your judgment. She adjusted her rifle slightly, taking another steadying breath. And then, without hesitation, she fired. Bang! The sound of her shot was crisp and clear, but it wasn't the shot itself that stunned the group. It was the result. The woman's bullet had hit the bullseye dead center. No deviation. No mistake. Just one clean, perfect shot. The group was silent. Even the champion, who had been so confident moments before, was left speechless. He walked over to the target, his heart pounding in his chest. The others followed behind him, each of them holding their breath as they took in the result. The shot had not only hit the center, it had broken the range's existing record. For a moment, no one spoke. They just stared at the target in disbelief. How could this woman with her outdated rifle, her humble appearance, possibly have done what they had spent years trying to achieve? How could she, with no high-tech gadgets or scopes, have outperformed them so effortlessly? The tall man who had mocked her earlier stood frozen for a moment before stepping forward. His grin had completely disappeared, replaced by a look of shock and, maybe for the first time, respect. Well, he muttered, his voice quieter than before. I guess you really did have something to prove after all. The woman said nothing. She simply nodded, her calm expression never faltering. The other shooters looked at her in a new light, no longer the quiet woman with an old rifle, but a skilled shooter who had just shown them all up in the most dramatic way possible. The group of shooters stood frozen, their eyes wide with disbelief. The sound of shots still seemed to echo in their ears, but the result was too much for them to process. The champion, who had been the undisputed king of the range for years, was left staring at the target as if the world around him had suddenly spun out of control. He had spent countless hours perfecting his craft, practicing with his custom rifle, and yet, in a single shot, this woman with her outdated, unremarkable weapon had just shattered his record. The tall man, who had been the first to mock her, was the first to approach the target. He walked slowly, almost as if trying to delay the inevitable, his steps unsure. The others followed, their faces filled with confusion and hesitation. They had all seen the champion's record. It wasn't easy to break. Everyone knew that. It took precision, practice, and the kind of gear that cost thousands of dollars. Yet, here was this woman with a rifle that looked like it had seen better days, calmly doing what none of them had expected. She had hit the bullseye and outdone their best efforts. The champion, who had been so smug just moments ago, was now struggling to comprehend what had just happened. His gaze fixed on the target, he took a step closer, his mind racing. He had been the best. No one had ever come close to matching his skill. But this woman who didn't even seem to care about all the expensive equipment he had done what he thought was impossible. When they reached the target, the quiet that had descended over the group felt heavier than ever. No one spoke. The group gathered around, staring at the hole in the paper. The shot wasn't just near the center, it was dead center. The woman had not only broken his record, but had done so with such precision that even the champion couldn't deny the sheer skill it took. He glanced at his own rifle, his once proud weapon, and for the first time, doubt crept into his mind. I don't understand, the champion finally muttered, almost to himself. His voice was weak, uncharacteristically hesitant. He had always prided himself on being the best, on being the one everyone looked up to, but now, standing in the presence of this woman, that pride seemed foolish, misplaced. The woman, however, wasn't interested in answering his question. She didn't need to. Her actions had already spoken louder than any words ever could. She hadn't needed to brag, to boast, or to make any grand statements. All she had needed to do was take her shot, and the result was undeniable. The other shooters, who had once laughed and mocked her, now stood in stunned silence. They had been so certain of their own superiority, so convinced that their top-of-the-line gear and years of practice made them invincible. But now they realized that all the money they had spent on their rifles, all the time they had invested in perfecting their skills, couldn't hold a candle to the quiet confidence and focus that the woman had brought to the range. One of the other shooters, a man who had been particularly vocal in his disbelief at the woman's presence, shifted uncomfortably. I thought you were just another amateur," he stammered, his voice no longer filled with mockery. The realization hit him hard. He had judged her based on her appearance, based on the worn-out rifle she carried, and now he was forced to confront the fact that his assumptions had been wrong. The woman didn't react to the words. She simply stood there, her face calm and composed, as if she had expected nothing less. She had nothing to prove to them. She had already proven everything that needed to be proven, not through words, but through her actions. She had shown them all that it wasn't the rifle that made the shooter, it was the shooter who made the rifle work. The champion, still grappling with the shock of the moment, finally stepped back. His earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by a grudging respect. He had been the best for so long, and now he was faced with the humbling reality that someone else could be better. He had been so caught up in his own self-importance, so blinded by his superior gear and reputation, that he had forgotten the most important aspect of shooting, the ability to stay focused, to be patient, and to execute under pressure. "I guess there's more to this than just the rifle," he admitted, his voice quieter now, filled with a mix of admiration and defeat. The woman nodded, but didn't respond. She didn't need to. The champion's words, though humble, couldn't erase the quiet truth that had been laid bare. True skill wasn't defined by the rifle or the equipment. It was defined by the shooter, by their focus, their precision, and their ability to remain calm under pressure. As the group stood in silence, still processing what had just happened, the woman turned and began to walk away from the shooting line. Her rifle was slung over her shoulder, the warm metal looking almost out of place against the polished, gleaming rifles of the others. But none of them dared to mock her now. They had learned their lesson, the lesson that sometimes true mastery wasn't about the gear you carried, but about the quiet confidence with which you wielded it. And that was a lesson they wouldn't forget anytime soon. The group stood in stunned silence, their eyes shifting between the woman and the target, still struggling to process the moment. The sound of the shot still seemed to echo, and the result was so unexpected that it felt almost unreal. No one could believe it. The champion's record, the one that had stood for years as a symbol of unmatched skill, had been shattered by a single shot from a woman with a basic, worn rifle. The champion, who had once stood so tall and proud, now appeared small in comparison. He paced around the target, his steps slow and deliberate as he circled it, inspecting the hole left by the woman's bullet. He squinted, as if hoping that the shot would somehow change or move. But it was real, undeniably, impossibly real. A perfect shot at the center, and just a fraction of an inch off from the absolute perfect score. A clean hit that left no room for doubt. "How is this even possible?" one of the shooters whispered, his voice tinged with disbelief. His eyes flickered from the woman's old rifle to the target and back again. It didn't make sense. He had been so sure that no one could beat the champion's record. They had all been certain that only the best gear, the most advanced rifles, and the highest level of training could lead to such a shot. Yet, here was this woman, calm, composed, with nothing but an old, almost forgotten rifle, and she had done it. She wasn't even using a fancy rifle, another shooter muttered, still unable to understand. His voice was shaky, betraying his disbelief. They had all thought that the superior equipment was the key to excellence, that the cost of their rifles was the price of success. But this woman had shown them that it wasn't about the gun, it was about the person behind it. The champion stopped in his tracks, standing still, his face frozen in a mix of frustration and astonishment. His gaze drifted from the target to his own rifle, which now seemed so much less important in comparison. His expensive, custom-built rifle, the one he had carefully chosen, tuned, and calibrated, suddenly felt inadequate. It was as if the years of practice, the thousands spent on the latest technology, the hours spent honing his skills, had all led into this one humbling moment. The woman had taken a single shot with a rifle that was far from perfect and had surpassed everything he had worked for. The realization hit him harder than any missed shot ever could. He had spent so much time focusing on perfecting his gear, on making sure every little detail was just right. He had been convinced that the best equipment would guarantee the best shot. But now, with the woman's quiet confidence and her flawless execution, he realized how wrong he had been. "Looks like I'm going to have to beat my own record," he said, his voice quiet and devoid of the arrogance that once defined him. It was a reluctant admission, but it was the truth. His earlier taunts and boasts seemed so insignificant now. There was no longer any confidence in his tone, only a quiet recognition of the woman's skill. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of respect for someone else. The woman, however, didn't need his respect. She hadn't come here for it. She had done what she came to do, proven that skill wasn't about the rifle you carried, the gear you wore, or the titles you held. It was about focus, precision, and the ability to perform under pressure. She hadn't been looking for validation from the others, and she certainly didn't need it now. She stood silently, her expression calm and unwavering, as the champion's words hung in the air. She didn't respond. There was no need. Her shot had spoken for her. Every snide comment, every mocking glance, and every assumption that had been made about her had been silenced in that one instant. She hadn't needed to defend herself or prove anything. She had let the result do the talking. The other shooters who had once looked down on her were now processing the gravity of the moment. It wasn't just the champion's record that had been broken. It was their entire way of thinking. They had all assumed that superiority came with money, with fancy gear, and with the highest levels of training. But now, they saw that true mastery was about far more than that. The woman had shattered their illusions and shown them that real skill transcends equipment and appearance. The air was thick with a newfound humility as the group of shooters slowly began to understand. They didn't speak at first. There were no more boasts, no more proud declarations, just quiet reflection as they processed the lesson they had just learned, the lesson that no amount of gear or money could replace the quiet power of focus, determination, and precision. And above all, the realization that the true value of a shooter wasn't in the rifle they carried, it was in the skill they brought to the line. The champion, still looking at the target, took one last look at his rifle before finally turning back toward the woman. His expression was no longer one of challenge, but of genuine respect. It was a moment of humility for him, a rare acknowledgement that someone else had bested him in a way he hadn't expected. The woman simply nodded, acknowledging the respect in his eyes, but still said nothing. Her actions had already spoken louder than words ever could. And as the shooter stood in silence, watching her walk away, they knew that this day, this moment, would stay with them for a long time. The champion stood before her, shoulders no longer squared with pride, but slightly slouched under the weight of realization. The air between them was still, thick with a tension that had nothing to do with rivalry and everything to do with respect. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't the center of attention. All eyes were on her, the woman who had come in unnoticed, underestimated, and had walked away as the best shot on the range. You broke my record," he said again, as if repeating it would help him accept it. His voice had lost its edge. It was soft now, carrying more disbelief than defeat. The woman gave a polite nod, nothing dramatic. "It's not about the rifle. It's about how you use it," she replied, her tone quiet but firm, like someone repeating a simple truth the world had forgotten. Those words hit him harder than the result itself. The champion's eyes widened slightly, the truth sinking deeper with each passing second. He had always prided himself on his equipment, his laser-cut scope, the carbon fiber barrel, the custom grips and balanced weight. To him, skill had always been tied to preparation and gear, and he had spent years fine-tuning both. But now, standing face to face with someone who had none of that and still outshot him, he realized he had been focusing on the wrong things all along. He glanced at her rifle, old, scratched, not even equipped with a modern scope. It looked like it belonged in a museum, not in competition. And yet it had just made history. Or rather, she had. "I guess I've got a lot to learn," he admitted. And this time there was no sarcasm, no smirk. The proud champion was gone. In his place stood a man who had been humbled, not by losing a title, but by discovering that skill could come from the most unexpected places. The other shooters watched the exchange in silence. Moments ago, they had been laughing, certain that the woman didn't belong there. Now, none of them dared to speak. The atmosphere had changed. The bravado that had filled the morning air had vanished, replaced by something quieter, heavier, respect. One of the shooters nudged his friend and muttered, "She just made him human again." And that was true. The champion, once untouchable in their eyes, had been brought back down to earth, not in disgrace, but in growth. He wasn't humiliated, he was transformed. In a world where status was often tied to gear and reputation, he had been reminded of the basics, of what really mattered. Steady hands, clear focus, inner calm. The woman, for her part, didn't gloat. She didn't boast. She didn't snap a selfie with the target or revel in the whispers. She simply stepped back, her rifle slung over her shoulder, eyes calm, posture still. She wasn't there for praise. She had come for the challenge, and she had met it with quiet strength. The champion offered a faint, genuine smile. "Thank you," he said, and it wasn't just for the lesson on the range. It was for the reminder that there was always someone better out there. Always room to grow. Always something more to learn. The woman met his gaze. "We're all just students," she said softly. "Even the best of us." With that, she turned and walked away from the shooting line, leaving behind a group of men who had come to the range thinking they knew everything, and were now rethinking everything they thought they knew. The champion watched her go, the weight of his ego replaced with something new. Humility. A better understanding. And maybe, just maybe, a bit of admiration. From that day forward, the shooting range would never be the same. And neither would he. Mental fortitude, by the discipline to continuously improve, and by the humility to recognize that every challenge was an opportunity to learn. The lesson had been hard-won, but it had made him a better shooter and a better person. Over the following weeks, the atmosphere at the shooting range underwent a subtle but profound transformation. The shooters who had once dismissed the woman, judging her based solely on her old rifle, began to reconsider their attitudes. They had been so quick to assume that skill was tied to the equipment, that a fancy rifle and an impressive scope could automatically make someone a better shooter. But now, they understood that true ability was rooted in focus, precision, and the ability to perform under pressure. The woman's actions had humbled them all. They had witnessed someone with little more than determination and an unassuming weapon do what they hadn't thought possible, take down the champion's record. It wasn't her gear, it was her skill. She had proven without a word that sometimes less is more and that mastering the fundamentals could make you unbeatable no matter what you held in your hands. The snobby shooters who once laughed and scoffed at those with cheap equipment began to show respect to anyone who walked through the range with a rifle in hand, no matter the brand or model. They started offering tips to beginners, helping them with their aim and stance, offering encouragement instead of judgment. It was as though the veil of superiority had been lifted, and they were finally able to see the range for what it truly was, a place to learn, to grow, and to push yourself to be better, no matter where you started. The change wasn't instantaneous, but over time the once boastful shooters began to adopt a quieter, more respectful approach to their craft. They spent more time practicing, refining their skills, and focusing less on their gear. Instead of flaunting their custom rifles, they focused on the power of their own ability, remembering the woman who had shown them that it was not the rifle that defined you, but how you used it. Their conversation shifted from discussing the latest high-tech scopes to talking about technique, precision, and focus. They began to realize that it wasn't the gear that made a true shooter, it was the person behind the rifle. And as for the woman, she never sought the recognition or attention she had earned. She never came back to the range to bask in the glory of breaking the champion's record. That wasn't why she was there. She didn't need the adoration, and she didn't need anyone's validation. What mattered most to her was the quiet knowledge that she had proven something, not just to the others, but to herself. Her actions had done all the talking. She had shown them that true mastery was not about boasting or wearing your accomplishments like a badge. It was about quietly proving your worth through hard work, focus, and a steadfast belief in your abilities. The woman, with her simple, unassuming demeanor, had won something far more valuable than just a record. She had earned the respect of those who had once ridiculed her. She had reminded them all that skill isn't measured by the equipment you carry, but by how you carry yourself and how you approach the task at hand. And in doing so, she had become a champion of a different kind, the kind whose true strength lies not in what they possess, but in how they use what they have. The champion, for his part, had changed in ways he never expected. He no longer boasted about his superior gear or his record. Instead, he focused on honing his own abilities. The focus had shifted from the rifle in his hands to the skills in his mind. He no longer believed that the latest technology would make him a better shooter. Instead, he spent his time perfecting his technique and learning from others, regardless of their equipment or background. No longer did he mock someone with an old rifle. He had learned the hard way that it wasn't the tools that made the person, it was the person who made the tools work. He had become a better competitor, not because he had the best gear, but because he had developed the mindset of a true champion, one who embraced the process of continuous learning and improvement. And so, as the days passed and the seasons changed, the shooting range became a place where skill, focus, and respect mattered more than any high-priced rifle. The story of the woman who had quietly shattered the champion's record remained in the minds of the shooters, a reminder that true mastery came from within, and that the greatest champions were not those who flaunted their titles, but those who quietly proved their worth, shot after shot.